we know Thoreau. Or so it seemed to me the first weekend of this month at the Tucson Festival of Books. Your congregation, with a little support from our Baja 4 congregations, organizes an annual booth showcasing the literature of Unitarian Universalists and invites the 35,000 festival attendees to get to know our faith a little bit better. And alongside this year, I brought Walden 2, the tiny house, to share. If you didn't get there to see it, Walden 2 is about 117 square feet. It's a homey little structure on a trailer, with a loft bed, a full kitchen, 3/4 bathroom. It was built by Summit Unitarian Universalist Fellowship to explore the writing of Henry David Thoreau and his life at Walden Pond. And the crowds of people who came to see it on that first day of the weekend, the day that I was able to be there, were of all backgrounds and all ages. And I mean that. If you were out there, you know, Mary Nell and Pi and all the other volunteers from here, you know it was from all backgrounds, all ages. And they already knew him. They already knew Thoreau. It's not that they all knew the same things about him. As writer Alan Hodder offers in his book, Thoreau's Ecstatic Witness, Thoreau has been many things to many people. And he elaborates, Thoreau the eccentric hermit, the Yankee stoic, the poet naturalist, the angry abolitionist, the philosophical anarchist and political critic, the transcendental economist, the consummate literary craftsman and philosopher of language, the proto-environmentalist, the modern hero of the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club, and even Thoreau, the postmodern philosopher. And I might add, the youngest in the crowd came to know Thoreau as a bear, as you have learned also this morning. There would seem that there are many, many Thoreaus that we know. And while this speaks to his popular appeal, I believe that there is a single thread among all these Thoreaus that makes him so appealing, so known to so many today. The fact is, Thoreau confessed to himself in one of his journals, I'm a mystic, a transcendentalist. And certainly that requires some unpacking. But I believe that in his observation, in his honesty with himself, lies that thread of the Thoreau we all know. Being a mystic was no new thing during Thoreau's life in the 1800s. As colonialization enveloped the world, the mystical path of many of our world's traditions was becoming illuminated through translations of Eastern sacred texts. Many of these translations were poorly done, impressing the colonizers' beliefs upon foreign traditions. But there were those, a few, including Unitarian intellectuals of New England, who sought more than an anglicized version of another person's truth. Instead, they listened, and they listened, and they listened. And in the teachings of Buddha, in the Hindu Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita, these individuals were inspired to relate to the divine in each and every instant of our natural world. As Thoreau suggested, you must live in the present, launch yourself on every wave, find your eternity in each moment. Fools stand on the island of opportunities and look toward another land. There is no other land. There is no other life but this. The mystic for Thoreau was the one who took up each day as an opportunity to deepen that relationship directly, intimately with the divine. And along with Thoreau, Unitarian intellectuals like William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Louisa May Alcott, Theodore Parker, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, and Walt Whitman were so inspired by this natural mysticism that they gathered together in small groups and they called themselves Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists were Unitarians who were more than a little bit disenchanted with the sobriety and rationalism of the early Unitarian church. They were just the second generation of Unitarians, but already they had severe criticisms. They called for an intuitive and passionate relationship with the divine, and they didn't find that in Sunday in their churches. Emerson criticized Unitarian preachers in his memoirs, naming that position of the Transcendentalists in response to Unitarians. Their cry, he said, was ever duty, duty, work, work. And they failed to address with equal power the soul and did not also shout joy, joy, delight, delight. The cure Transcendentalists prescribed for Unitarianism was the practice of self-culture. Culture, they meant in its agricultural sense as the cultivation of something to grow. They then sought to expand their moment-to-moment relationship with the divine through the natural world by this self-cultivation. Very far from self-centeredness, Thoreau and the Transcendentalists believed that this disciplined practice led one to an active response to injustice. Their cry might have well been joy, duty, delight, work. In short, they sought a deep meaning, and then through that action with their lives. And if that doesn't sound familiar to you as Unitarian Universalists, well, we've got some more work to do then. Thoreau captured all of this in his writing and his life, I would say perhaps better than any other of his contemporaries. He wrote in Walden, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and if not, when I came to die, discover I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all of the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms." Thoreau's most famous action arising from his conscience was then to refuse to pay his taxes. He was unwilling to participate in the government's complicity in slavery and what he saw as an unprovoked war with Mexico. "Unjust laws exist," he writes. "Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress all at once?" His choice to transgress openly and non-violently got him a night in jail. And some say Emerson showed up to pay his taxes, but it was in fact his aunt. But more than this, he received the emulation of Mahatma Gandhi and Reverend Dr. King generations later in their justice movements. So Thoreau has remained an astounding influence in justice work today. And as I told the crowds at the festival, his thought on simple living was just simplify, simplify. I shared with them that on the environmental justice, he wrote, What is the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on? Now, in preparing for the Festival of Books, a short video I made, standing up and sharing the tiny house as well as Thoreau's work, a friend of mine reminded me that all of this influence, all of this impact on justice today, it goes completely against who Thoreau was. Because he was an individual first and foremost. And while he wrote broadly in encompassing statements, he never sought to teach. He never sought to instruct or to guide or to tell us what we should do or should not do. He lived his life, and then he wrote about it. One of his encompassing observations from Walden, and please pardon his patriarchal language, about our very souls was this: the mass of men live in quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city, you go into the desperate country, and you have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats. A stereotyped but unconscious despair is concealed even under what we call the games and amusements of mankind. From 165 years ago, he calls to us and calls us out today. Because there is so much, too much in our lives that is superficial, that are games and amusements of humankind. When we are hungry for something more, that we are despairing, despite on the surface that we possess so much, and we present that as contentment or as happiness. Thoreau lived his example not by his tutelage, but by his words to show us that we are estranged. We are estranged from our natural world. We are estranged from our neighborhoods and our communities. And as we saw earlier this month in the example of the United Methodist Church, who denied their own gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer members and ministers, we can be estranged from our churches. Now, lest you think that somehow Unitarian Universalists are above that, earlier this month, our UU World magazine estranged transgender Unitarian Universalists with an article, After L, G, and B. We can be estranged from our churches. And when I shared how Thoreau called me out with individuals at the Festival of Books, where we started as strangers, we quickly found common ground. Because I saw the pain in their eyes when we talked about estrangement from our world, from our neighbors, from our faith. And I recognized there that we are estranged from ourselves. We are hungry. We are starving for lives of meaningful connections. Connections that give us the opportunity to intuit our own meanings, not from globalized doctrines impressed upon us, but from relationship. Not from boxes that we are put in, but for our personal experience of relationship with ourselves and one another, with our churches, with our neighborhoods, with nature itself. And Thoreau stands as an example that it can be done, although he's never going to tell us how. He stands as an example that we are all strangers in a strange land. We are individuals, unique and mortal, beautiful and flawed, delightful and dutiful. We would prefer to be welcomed. We would always prefer to be welcomed. But that doesn't mean that we don't have that experience, that reality of being the stranger and of challenging and changing the norms of the world around us. But first, each of us starts out as the individual on a personal journey. And we seek deep relationships that would offer us deeper meaning. But as Thoreau did, we begin alone. We start alone and hungry. And we can find ourselves deeply estranged. But Thoreau tells us that there is potential then to build relationships. The Thoreau we know shows us that it can be done. I deeply enjoyed the opportunity of sharing Walden 2 to connect with so many different people at the Tucson Festival of Books. As the Saturday grew on, I found myself being more and more reflective with them. And I started sharing with them about my overnight stay in Walden 2 when it was at my congregation in Amado. I described the grove of mesquite trees that we parked it in, with the porch facing the peaks of the Santa Rita Mountains. I stayed overnight and enjoyed the multitude of stars. And while I was never claustrophobic, I didn't want to be inside the tiny house any longer than I needed to. Life and deep relationship was waiting right outside those tiny walls. And I think that's what Thoreau wants us to remember. It's why 165 years ago, he lived at Walden Pond for 2 years, 2 weeks, and 2 days. He found a place in the world where he could ask himself, what would I do? Who am I going to be? And what are the relationships that I will build? And among those people, Tucson Festival of Books, and in the spirit of Thoreau, in simplicity and sustainability and injustice of relationships with nature and society and church and ourselves, and to the divine, I ask them to imagine their favorite place in the world. Imagine the most beautiful place you know. Imagine living there without harming it or leaving any significant impact, but instead being in relationship with it. Being fed by it when you're hungry. Living with it when you're starving. That place where we can once again be whole in all of our relationships, in all of our lives, within ourselves. It's a long journey of 165 years to today. And yet it is a journey that leads us to this moment, this place, this people. The example of Thoreau's life that may be a lesson despite his wishing it wouldn't ever be. A lesson for each of us to find our own place of relationship, of meaning, of life. May it be so. I invite you to take just a few minutes to write down your personal thoughts and feelings in the notebooks that are being shared.